Great. Well, thanks, Francis, for the introduction and the invitation. And thanks, everyone, for coming here today. And for those in the future, thanks for finding this video recording. As Francis said, my name is Robert Roth. I'm a professor at the University of Wisconsin. I'm also the director of the University of Wisconsin Cartography Lab. But today I'm primarily representing my service to the International Cartographic Association and our connections to the Geosemantics Commission. And so just some quick background. I am the chair of a different commission that currently is called the Commission on the User Experience. This is one of the longest running commissions. You can see in this graphic from Menayon Kroc and Sarah Fabrikant. We've been around since about the 1980s and have been working on various kinds of user issues. The commission was reimagined, relaunched in 2003 to bring our interest in user issues into a more digital environment. And so thinking about topics of usability and user-centered design alongside traditional map use topics. And today we're thinking about user experience. And so when Francis invited me to talk about geosemantics, I kind of was a little nervous at first because I don't necessarily frame my research too much as semantics. But as Francis said, I'm on sabbatical, so I can just kind of run with a lot of different thought exercises. And by the end of this prep, I kind of actually learned that I am doing semantics quite a bit. It might not exactly be the type of semantics that we're often discussing in this lecture series. So just to give you a roadmap of where we're headed, I'm going to first start with a little bit of background on UX design, particularly some of the work that I've done that was heavily inspired by the Use Commission before I was chair. I'm then going to be talking about how my framing of syntactics might be moving into more of a discussion of semantics and providing some background on what those terms mean in linguistics. I'm then going to talk about two studies that have yet to be published. I've talked a little bit about these studies at ICA events, but as I'm writing these two studies up during my sabbatical, this reframing of semantics has really given me some interesting insight that I'll be bringing into those write-ups. And so particularly the use of metaphor as a kind of a semantic concept in linguistics. And I'll just very briefly close with an outlook about is what I just talked about. Geosemantics, is it cartosemantics? Is there a difference? Is it all the same? And then open it up for discussion. So to first get into UX design, to cut to the chase, I really like to present this example or this juxtaposition of what I find to be the two most heavily used interactive maps in sort of the Western world, the English-speaking world. Google Maps is something that's used by billions of people, but maybe only seconds each day. ArcGIS Pro is, I think the last time I looked, had about 100,000 subscriptions, but the folks that are using ArcGIS Pro use this tool all day long as part of their work, right? And so how do we have such different user experiences on these two different tools, right? One having a very general use case with low maybe user motivation, having very high usability, immediately learnable, but low utility. Another is very expert use, high motivation, low usability, you might say, relative at least to Google Maps, but very, very powerful, very high utility. And so we can talk about these differences in very holistic terms like usability and utility. But when it comes down to it, how are we actually designing the functionality different? And that's what user experience design is really all about, is trying to design and deliver these productive but also satisfying user experiences with tools that are often interactive. And so as a graduate student a decade ago, I'm going to be kind of looking a lot into my past during this talk. I was heavily inspired by the visual variables, which I find to be kind of the one true kind of theoretical framework that we have in cartography, and it has come from cartography. It at least is one that has really stood the test of time over the last 50 years. Essentially, the visual variables are the basic building blocks of any graphic, of any representation. And so in our case, of any map. The visual variables are based on essentially the way that our eyes evolved to see differences in the visual scene. And so there's a finite number of ways that we can actually change our symbols to encode information. Understanding that gives us the full solution space from which to draw when we're choosing alternatives in our maps. And so it provides us sort of a basic framework of the sort of the limited number of options that we have available in design. This is what ultimately can be described, and I'll describe later, as syntactics, where we understand sort of a basic syntax of these building blocks, and we can start to deconstruct our visuals according to these basic building blocks in a very sort of structuralist manner. And so I want to just shout out to our textbook. This is a graphic to our textbook, Mapping for a Sustainable World, that was co-published by the ICA and United Nations. We're really trying to explain that even though mapping is heavily, heavily creative, and the combination of these sort of musical notes can be infinite, when you really distill them down to the notes, there's only a basic set of options. And that really empowers the designer and also enables us to see the intentions, reveal the intentions of the designer, which we'll get to in terms of semantics in a second. So in my dissertation, I asked, is there a syntactics of interaction? Can we similarly deconstruct a tool like Google Maps into its constituent parts, what I might call interactive primitives, and then compare that to the same constituent parts of, say, ArcGIS Pro to similarly define the solution space for UX and also understand the intentions behind the folks who were conducting the UX design. So I went out and did a big lit review and found that we have really been talking about these topics in lots of different ways. There's myriad language used around potential sort of generic basic primitives, things we might today call pan, zoom, et cetera. And so to try to come up with maybe a composite or more consistent taxonomy of interaction primitives, I went out and I took all the definitions from that lit review, and then also ran interviews with 21 experts that have been working at the time with the GeoVista Center at Penn State, where I completed my PhD. Anything that could be, any statement that sounded like an interaction became then a card that I ultimately had UX designers sort in a sort of an open card sort. And so we generated 206 different sort of interaction statements based on this content analysis, and then with interviews, and then essentially forced my friends to spend about 2-3 hours to try to make sense out of all of these statements. So this is a shaded matrix that's sorted based on the similarity that any two cards were in the same category. And the triangular sort of nature of this diagram was really exciting because it shows that there's consistency, despite the phrases, the terms we were using, there's consistency in the actual doing of these interactions. You want to see this as a very strongly sorted matrix. And so this resulted in kind of a first pass taxonomy of operator primitives that I've been using throughout the last decade in my own research as kind of that solution space or syntactics for UX design. And so just as a quick introduction, some of these operators change the map design. So re-expression might actually change a different thematic map type. We're going to talk about this in a second. You might be able to have overlays or underlays. This is a classic sort of GIS interaction, GIS metaphor. You can sequence through perhaps a set of atlas pages or an interactive animation. You could change all the symbolization decisions. And so Color Brewer is just a great example of all those alternatives. Some of these change the user's perspective to the map. And so the classic Slippy map has panning and zooming, but you can also reproject or rotate the map and rearrange a series of maps in your current view. Finally, the final subset, change or derive content not previously available on the map. And these are really, you could do this in a sort of a pre-digital form, but it would take a really long time to, say, filter 100,000 records, right? So this is really where the digital is giving us the advanced ability to search, to filter, and then ultimately to retrieve details on demand and run complex calculations like a routing algorithm. Okay, so that is sort of the foundation that I'm trying to bring to user experience design in terms of a syntactics that might be similar to the visual variables. Interestingly, though, the visual variables in one sense are useful to know the full solution space, but they're, I think, even more powerful because they provide a groundwork for how to then use these visual variables in different design contexts. And so this is where I had been sort of describing sort of the visual variables as a syntactics, but Alan McEachran really was trying to impress upon this as more semantics. And so one of the sort of great resources that I actually read last night to come back into some of these ideas around semantics is How Maps Work, Alan McEachran's book. I should note that Alan was my PhD advisor, and I wanted to go work with him because I read the book. I didn't read the book because he forced me to. And so it's kind of a constant source of inspiration for me. And I've read it now, embarrassingly, probably 24 times. And each time I'm finding something new. And this time around, it was the importance of semantics. And so what I had missed in my initial reading was that Alan described the articulation of the visual variables as the syntactics, but actually the relationship to the level of measurement as semantics. And so the semantics here being how we apply our symbol to something that we're trying to represent, whether it's idea or a real world object. And so if we look at this figure from our textbook, there are semantics that are embedded. We've really tried to provide recommendations in the book for folks without a cartography background. And so we're really identifying which visual variable should be paired with which levels of measurement, even though some of these visual variables might be appropriate perceptually for additional levels of measurement. We're really trying to show the primary use case. However, our coding by design perspective and content really is more a description of the operator and not a true sort of semantic framework. So to get into what we're really trying to accomplish with semantics, and this again is some of the genius of how maps work and the ambition, I would say, of how maps work, is to understand this idea of semantics versus syntactics from the discipline of semiotics. So really a research thrust growing out of linguistics that's trying to understand how signs are constructed, how they are, to use Alan's words, imbued with meaning. And so to start here, we have the sign vehicle. And so this is a map symbol, so something like a visual variable. And then we have what Alan called the interpretant. This is the intended meaning. And so think about maybe a concept, something that is interpreted from the sign vehicle. And this forms a pairing, a dyad. A sign doesn't ever work out of context. A stop sign only is understandable because we can read the word stop. We understand that red is often encoded with danger. Something that's an octagon is unusual in the environment, so might draw our attention. All of those have these additional implicit contextual meanings. And so take a second and think about the word tree. What comes to mind? What is your interpretant? Picture a tree. Did you picture something that was circular and rounded and kind of fluffy? If you did, then probably you have grown up or currently live in a primarily deciduous forested area, or that's the tree that maybe you planted in your backyard. If you're growing up in a more temperate forest with coniferous trees, or if you're getting ready for the holidays way too early, you might have thought of something more triangular in nature, right? And so we can have slightly different interpretants based on our lived experience. As the cartographer, we're trying to find a dyad that's going to work unambiguously for our population, but there's always, for our audience, but there's always going to be some of that semantic difference in the interpretation. And so the example I like to use in class, I'm currently in Madison, Wisconsin, which is on ancestral Ho-Chunk land, also the current capital of the state of Wisconsin. And I always like to talk to students about the process of mapping isn't trying to directly reflect reality. It's trying to find an encoding, a sign vehicle that unambiguously encodes that reality. And so Madison State Capitol is famous for its radial symmetry. It is oriented in the cardinal directions, yet we still use a star as the sign vehicle because it communicates a sense of prominence, right? And so the capital being offset from other kinds of cities through that star, right? A classic example that's used in semiotics is that of coffee. And so when I hear coffee, I think something, this is our department symbol here, our cow. When I think coffee, I think of something in a mug, right? And most of the global north are thinking about the drinking of the coffee, the warm, soothing drinking of that coffee, not the actual coffee bean or all of the apparatus around getting it into our mugs, right? And so semiotics, we have our Wisconsin geography mugs, but semioticians have their classic coffee mug where they're showing this dyad of the word coffee mug, the idea of this warm coffee mug, but then a third thing, the mug itself, right? And so often our interpretant and our sign vehicle are also being mediated by a referent, actual geographic feature. There's an argument in philosophy if there's such a thing as a real world out there. I think for geographers, we study the planet Earth. I hope there is something there. And so we can typically want to include the referent as part of our thinking about semiotics. In doing so, then, we can see how each aspect of the sign itself can actually mediate one another. This is called semiosis. And so the process of becoming a sign, or how meaning, how semantics are produced. And it doesn't start with just the idea or the interpretant. It doesn't start with just the sign vehicle, even though cartographers probably would love to say that we can influence unambiguously. And it doesn't just start with the referent. Each has the opportunity to change the other. And so to reverse my example of the state capitol, our tulips on the Capitol grounds are grown in as stars to show the signal, the map symbol, right? And so we've actually now brought the map into the reality. That's the power of mapping, right? Is that we have the ability to affect change to both the way people think, the interpretant, and the way the world is in its reference, right? Each one of these is mediating. So we're not just drawing from the interpretant and the referent, we're actively, through the process of semiosis, influencing those, right? And this is a playful example of tulips in Capitol Lawn, but obviously there are dangers to this type of power that cartographers need to be really intentional about. Okay, so bringing it back to what we're doing here between semantics and syntactics, the cartographer is often placed at the sign vehicle, right? And so that's truly what we are doing, is choosing sign vehicles. This is a classic, now over 100-year-old sort of way of thinking about then what are the dimensions of semiosis? And so how is this active production of meaning occurring? Syntactics is an understanding the differences among multiple sign vehicles. And so this is what Alan would describe as how sign systems work. But essentially the relationships among our alternatives. And symbol is a loaded word in semiotics. I'm using it the way cartographers use it. And so I'm not trying to use it as a semiotician, but essentially how we would choose our graphic marks in a map. This is what I was doing in my PhD research until Francis made me go out and read all this semiotics work for this lecture. This is what I thought I was still doing in my research up to today. One thing we're not going to talk too much about, I might just close with an opinion, but another way that we can think about this mediation is through the interpretant. This is what's described in semiotics as pragmatics. And so these are the cultural perceptual dimensions of reading, of using a map, but it's also the social dimensions, and probably more importantly, the social processes in which meaning is created and shared, negotiated, and constructed. And so pragmatics really aligns a lot with sort of processual cartography, maybe critical cartography writ large, something that is showing how sort of meaning is constantly being negotiated through our choices and our sign vehicles. What I do want to talk a lot about today is how we might be influencing the referent. And this is where semioticians call semantics. And so how do we get a sign vehicle, and so here our map symbols, to meaningfully stand for features in the world. And so again, I didn't think I was necessarily doing this in my current research until I reread Alan, and of course, Alan had it all laid out for me all along. And I should note that I'm particularly drawing from chapter 5 of How Maps Work, which is a really great synthesis that draws on an eclectic set of resources. So not just Alan, but I think his real contribution is really putting it all together in a package that makes sense to a cartographer. One thing that's important is, though, even though semantics is the relationship of that sign vehicle to the referent, it still is being mediated by the interpretom. And so we get a different interpretive distance depending on the sign vehicle we choose. Something can be very realistic, what we would describe even cartography. A linguist would call this literal. Something could be very abstract, the word we use in cartography. A linguistic might use the word metaphorical. And metaphor is also a loaded word in semiotics. I'm using it in kind of a more popular usage, right? And so we have that ability to think about the metaphorical distance in our symbol designs. So don't just take it from me. Alan has a great set of micro lectures that are on YouTube. This one in particular draws from his first semiotics. Take a look. Once again, I always go back. Literally, like I've highlighted every word at some point. It doesn't really make sense to have this much highlighting, but each read always something super valuable. And for me this time around, it was on this background on semantics, this primer on semantics. So let's bring it back to what I'm talking about here. Representing is the user experience commission. I like this idea of metaphor as a basis of semantics because that's what our digital interactions are. They're all metaphors for the way in which we interact with actual physical items. And so panning and zooming, that's bringing the map closer to our face and maybe moving the map or allowing our eyes to move around it. We can request a different map type with the same view in terms of re-expression. That GIS metaphor of transparency overlays, these are all things that can be done physically, sequencing through an atlas. And even something like filtering, which is complex and can include thousands of data points, is something that we have been doing since children. We've been sorting blocks by their shape, right? And unfortunately, it's something that is continuing to be done as we sort and classify and filter out people by, say, their gender or their sexual orientation or their race. And so this is important because not all interactions are beneficial. Not all map representations are beneficial. Some harmful interactions, however, might lead us to reflect and to be better in the future. And so this is the power of a semantic approach to user experience design, to interaction, is that we need to be intentional as cartographers in understanding sort of the outcomes, the potential harmful interactions in our decisions, right? And try to constrain harmful ones unless there's a reason. I'll try to give you an example of both a harmful interaction that has no benefit and one that maybe is congruent with the severity of the topic at hand. Okay, so let's get to some empirics here. If you see me talk at ICA, I probably mentioned this tool, Map Study. This was a research tool funded by the National Science Foundation that tries to develop the Qualtrics for maps. One thing, if you've ever tried to make an interactive map, I always say it takes 10 times the resource, 10 times the time. Going interactive is difficult, which means researching interactive maps is also often 10 times the work. And so this idea was to try to make it easier for folks to quickly stand up studies that included interactive maps. And so here you can see just the sort of the typical map study configuration, an interactive map on the left, a question set on the right. The map can be the whole screen. It can be scrollable like a story map. The questions can come in earlier and later, but each one of these operator primitives is just a binary Boolean on and off, and then it configures to the data set that you've provided for us. And then you can ask both quantitative and qualitative questions. Just a note here, as we're pulling this up, we have this great configuration tool. Map Study was heavily developed by Carl Sack, who sadly passed away earlier this year. I would love to have known Carl Sack, one of my former PhD students. I'd love to have known what he thought about my movement into semantics here, and as well as Nick Underwood and Gareth Baldrica Franklin, really the core developers and folks who are maintaining this tool. But essentially, it's like Qualtrics. You can configure it without touching a line of code. It's heavily modular, and so I mentioned this just because you can start to ask factorial study designs by choosing from this modularization. And so you can load in different base maps, you can load in different thematic maps configured to your customized data. Again, all the interactions are provided out of the box, and they're tracking these interactions. And so you get the full sequence. This is really important for studying syntactics. Arthur Robinson and Barbara Bartz-Prochetnik argued that maps couldn't have a syntax because they're not read linearly. However, when you interact, you have a linear sequence of events, and that trail, that sequence, gives you insight into the meaning and the intention behind the user. And so we now are really getting at a syntactical and semantic approach. Finally, then, there's a whole suite of question sets. Really, anything you can do with Qualtrics, we've tried to implement in this. Okay, so just a couple examples. And again, these are two studies that I have spoke about in the last year or two at ICA events, using my sabbatical to try to finally write them up, and have kind of reimagined through this question prompt from Francis what I'm trying to get at through these studies. The first is all about visual metaphors, and we're really trying to think about thematic web maps. What does it mean for not just a reference map or a Slippy map, but trying to really encode thematic data? And so I like to come back once again to Alan McEachran, having, as I keep reflecting, I'm still relearning from his contributions. And this great paper with David DiBiase, where they talk about the differences among thematic maps. They don't use the word metaphor, but essentially each one of these thematic maps gives you a different framing of the same enumerated data. And so ultimately, from a linguistic standpoint, a different metaphor on how you should be approaching the same content. Your thematic maps can be either discrete or continuous. And so a metaphor of objects at particular places, or phenomenon that vary across space, or they can be abrupt and smooth. And so things that change at borders, where borders are meaningful, or things that are more gradual in their changing, that don't have the same constraint in their borders. And so there's an election coming up. I don't know, hopefully when you're watching this video out there, we're well past this particular stressful moment in the United States, at least. I'm sure it's stressful for other places in the world as well. But to bring in this example, a different thematic map for the same data, this is showing the 2016 election, is giving you a metaphor to think about the election differently. The Carto nerd, Ken Fields map of one-to-one dot density map, so every vote, is how I think many Americans wish the US election ran, where our individual vote, our populist vote, does matter. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Instead, it's more the choropleth map, where we have an electoral college that whoever wins each state, there's a different electoral process to assign these votes per state. And so often the popular vote and the electoral college vote are different, right? And so instead of thinking about the individual, thinking about you, we're thinking about the governmental status and its regulation of policy, right? We can go to some maybe alternatives as well. The New York Times always includes proportional symbol map. This is more thinking about centers or sites of sort of political influence, or we could be thinking about more of an isoline map. This is Tim Wallace's great the two Americas map, showing Clinton and Trump as isoline maps. This is more dynamic in its influence, or particularly spread across. Importantly, these also give different interaction metaphors. And so the discrete metaphor gives you something that feels directly clickable, right? You might be thinking about retrieving from that, right? It feels like an object that you can grab, that you can touch, right? The more continuous, and particularly the continuous and smooth, feel more like surfaces that you would slide or move than something that you maybe click, right? This is a hypothesis of mine. And so it's not just a visual metaphor in representation, it's also an interactive metaphor. And so we ran a study, a map study, where I had one factor. We're looking at these four groups. We were looking at hypothetical Twitter data in this really great region to study in Kansas, where it almost has like a perfect alignment of actual data. Again, an interactive map, we needed to actually have a base map. And we had elementary versus general tasks. And so that's important because the general tasks could be solved without interacting. You could just look at the overview map and answer that. In order to solve the elementary tasks, you had to interact. And so it's really difficult to compare non-interactive and interactive. This was our solution, at least in this study. And then we asked folks, we measured their accuracy. There was a right answer. We looked at confidence, their perceived difficulty, and then we collected their interaction frequencies and free responses. This is a factorial ANOVA analysis of that result. And so just to orient you, our different conditions within the factors are running vertically. Our different dependent variables are running horizontally. And so kind of a large table showing, sorry, our inferential statistics, not ANOVA because it's a single factor design. So how are we getting with, how does this relate to semantics? The first thing that we found was that the dot density map led to much lower accuracy. We believe the reason being is that dot density maps are randomly generating the location of dots. And when you move across scale, as expected with an interactive Slippy map, the view you're getting as the next randomly generated view, which often even changes the dot value, is disorienting. And so you have a hard time relating the two different scales or zoom levels as you're reading that map. And so in terms of semantics, it's becoming much more difficult, really kind of getting in the way when we provide an interaction in order to make sense, to glean meaning from that map, right? Here, the interaction is differentially getting in the way on different map types, with dot density the one that's losing. We also are seeing that in particular, dot density panning interactions are significantly higher. I mentioned that not all interactions are good and gave a very serious example. Panning often is a suboptimal interaction. It shows that folks are lost, that they're not getting what they want, that they're trying to reorient themselves to something off screen. And so as a suboptimal interaction, and often in user experience design, helps us diagnose what we need to be fixing as we're running usability studies. And once again, the dot density map, it's panning that is going up, suggesting that people are lost as they're shifting scale. What's also interesting is that the continuous had a self-reported increase in ease and confidence. And we believe that's because it sort of filled the full border or filled the full viewport. And so as you're zooming in, you're not getting potential negative space that doesn't have a large amount of symbols. And so again, thinking about how this impacts, how these visual metaphors impact meaning, the choropleth map might be the one that actually is the most usable in this particular context because we're always going to have a symbol as we keep zooming and zooming in further. The second study that, again, we're still writing up is our approach to try to apply data feminism principles to interactive maps. And I really want to give a shout out to Megan Kelly and Nick Lally, who are now at Syracuse in Kentucky, for bringing these principles into interaction design, because they really are thinking about semantics. And so here we haven't looked at just 4 kinds of thematic maps. We've chosen 2 maps that are at individual level data and 2 maps that are aggregated of the same very sensitive data. These are data depicting either civil war deaths in Aleppo or police killings in Oakland. And so something that is newsworthy, something that is sensitive, and something that we're trying to generate empathy for the data that are being mapped. In the individual, we looked at both just a regular dot and a pictorial icon of a human body, with the hypothesis that that pictorial icon would draw more empathetic response to this information, mapped information. As a second factor, we also looked at the difference between a regular sort of street vector-based map and then a satellite image. And again, this gets at that interpretive distance around semantics. And so is it directly representing that reality, or are we trying to abstract it in some way? And we thought that in this case, bringing the interpretive distance together, so shortening it, would help people imagine themselves in this place, which we also thought could further humanize this information. The third factor that we looked at in this study was the pop-up information itself. And so is there a difference in sort of your classic ArcGIS Online table of quantitative information, what we might call sterile information in this case, or a more narrative qualitative approach? And so that even included the names and the neighborhood names of some of these victims. And so again, these decisions that we're making need to be made with intention. And so are we doing justice to the sensitivity, the severity of the topic at hand through our selection of representations and interactions? So again, another big table. This is the, again, the dependent variables are running horizontal. The independent variables or the factors are vertical. So again, just to think about some meaning here, one thing we found, I should have mentioned, our task here was to choose from a series of humanitarian sites and to place, so a classic site selection task. There was no correct answer to this. We just wanted to see if there was any difference. And then we asked folks to take the PANIS affect scale test afterward to see how their positive or negative affect might have changed as a result of interacting with this map. Okay. So first, what we found, unfortunately, was that the site selection does change by map type. This is not good if you think about how maps influence, how sign vehicles influence their reference, right? That the two different representations can lead to two different physical sighting of places in the landscape, right? And so maybe that's to be expected, but it certainly is something that knowing that and the severity of this topic was important to be aware of, right? That decision makers might not all come to the same decision based on the map that they're getting. We also found that the site changed based on qualitative versus quantitative pop-ups. And so again, there was no right answer. And in the paper write-up, we have some ideas on how we place these 5 points and what values might be brought based on which sites were selected. But nonetheless, there was a difference here. And so even what we're including in something as simple as a pop-up can lead to this impact in the referent, right? A change in the real world. A couple of interesting, maybe more semantic or syntactic findings. When we provided the imagery-based map, zooming went up substantially, significantly, I should say. And so something about satellite imagery in terms of meaning implicitly suggests to look in for more detail, right? That you want to actually go all the way down to the community, to the neighborhood level. And so if you want to encourage zooming, a satellite image-based map might be the better approach. And in cartography, we want abstraction, but there does appear to be some semantic value in providing satellite imagery-based maps, at least in terms of promoting or evoking zooming. We also found that when we use the aggregated view, so the choropleth and proportional symbol, retrievals went up. And so this was a little surprising because we thought in terms of the interaction metaphor, wouldn't an individual point or a body icon feel more clickable? Where instead, we believe from the qualitative data, because it was aggregated, people wanted to see what was inside the aggregation. And so having more detail once again, this time in the attribute rather than in space. What's important though, is even though people clicked on the icon less, there was a significant increase in negative affect after seeing the iconic value. And so this is an interaction that maybe wasn't as productive or as positive as we originally hoped, where people are getting access to this narrative or quantitative information about these individuals. But nonetheless, it led people to consider and be more aware and more empathetic about this phenomenon, which ultimately might be leading them to be better in the future, to be more aware and more just in the future. And so that's semantic meaning. Okay, I just got the 4-minute outcome from Francis here, so we'll move into our wrap up. So just as an outlook, I want to be super speculative right now. What we're really trying to do through this conversation, I think, Francis, is see where the Geosemantics Commission and the User Experience Commission might come together. And the ICA has a great tradition of joint commission meetings, joint commission special issues, of really trying to take a question that we think we have solved and spin it through collaboration, right? And so I'm going to try to spin the semiotic triangle here to maybe suggest some areas of productive overlap. As I was reading some definitions of geosemantics, I really began to think that this is primarily thinking about the relationship of the interpretant and the referent. And so we're trying to take data about the referent, geographic information, and infer or discover some sort of meaning or interpretance from that geographic information. And so this type of semantics really is thinking about the dyad between the interpretant and the referent and mediating those tensions. If I want to maybe suggest a cartosemantics, cartographers and user experience designers are bringing back the sign vehicle, right? And so rather than inference and discovery, still important throughout the research phases of cartography, we also are thinking about meaningful representation of and interaction with geography. And so by bringing the sign vehicle back in, we're thinking not just about the discovery of new ideas, but how to then package them to have maximum impact out in the world, to really truly solve the biggest geographic problems that are facing humanity. And so we're really thinking about the audience, the user experience, right? And so maybe a cartosemantics is that mediation between the sign vehicle and the referent. You might say this is a metaphor for the difference between cartography and GI science. Broadly, I'm really painting in broad brushes here. I'm trying to be speculative, right? You might say that this is a tension that's growing between cartography and GeoAI in terms of how much of the meaning making do we want to hand over to machines, and how much of the meaning communication do we want to retain as sentient humans, essentially. And to come back to that one phrase that I didn't really talk much about, pragmatics, that relationship between the sign vehicle and the interpretant, that's what I think our commissions might be able to work together on, right? Is how we can work through a process to provide some guidelines on this sort of geosemantic GeoAI discovery in relation to a more humanized cartography. And yeah, really, I invite everyone in this audience to contribute to that dialogue. With that, I'm at time, Francis, and so I'd like to open it to questions, but thank you, everyone, for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Rob, for that really stimulating presentation. I can imagine there's lots of questions, but we're really going to have to find the vocabulary for the questions, I think. So I want to encourage people again, if they want to just write their question in the chat, that might be a good way to do that. But of course, we've got the possibility, if you raise your hand, that you can just speak it out now too and share your question with us. Does anybody have any burning questions that they would like to ask? Nianhua Liu, you're first.
Yep. Hi, Prof. So it's really nice presentation, and then we also follow lots of on the work for Alan. So I just got a question because in the study that you have mentioned, and also the research now, that I think it's based on in the context of mostly, I guess, it's the 2D and also based on the, let's say, the computer map or by this kind of monitor. But looking the future now, we start to see lots of the new map, for example, like 3D those, and by the new platform, like the mixed reality or such as this kind of examples. But do you think this kind of the semantics and also all the research now, should we also going more to like match the new this kind of trade, like 3D or like mixed reality, and then what's the difference or what's the similarity could be in this kind of the transformation to the future, like the platform and the context? Yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks for that question. And I'll start with the 3D, and then we can move into mixed reality. So 3D, looking at this slide, is really trying to bring the sign vehicle and the referent into direct overlap, right? And so almost having a digital twin in which you have a full replication of reality as the sign vehicle, right? I'm really interested in thematic mapping and sort of storytelling with thematic maps. And so generally, we know that 3D makes it more difficult to interpret thematic maps. That might not always stand to be the case as technology changes, but usually a planimetric view provides a statistical abstraction that is easier to grapple with than something that is the reality itself, and that's the value. That said, in terms of reference mapping, wayfinding, urban planning, all sorts of applications where you might start to see the sort of digital twin idea. But this is really a semantic question, is how close to reality do we want the sign vehicle? And so I think in thinking about that, I would ask, what is the meaning that you're trying to communicate, and what is the value of that meaning, and what are the kind of cognitive perceptual limits of your audience that are receiving that meaning as well. So the mixed reality is interesting because it almost flips the sign vehicle and the representation, where the representation becomes the sign vehicle, and you are then adding things on top of it that are now made real by your device. There's actually something called, and I think Alan called these P representations, phenomenon representations versus concept representations. And so there's like a branch of semiotics that has tried to grapple with this that I don't think has any influence in AR, VR right now, that could provide some really interesting insight into what that sort of reversal looks like. And so rather than the two coming together, it truly is reversed in that sense. And so I feel like would be a really interesting sort of semantic interpretation of AR, VR that I just don't think has been done yet. So, but thanks for the question.
Okay. Moving on, we have a question in the chat from Hong Yu Tsang. Could you provide some examples of non-human centered practices in cartography? I'm reading that in case somebody doesn't have the chat open.
Non-human centered practices in cartography. And so when I hear human-centered, I use the term user-centered because a lot of these concepts started in sort of software engineering and product management, and which I think are important topics for cartographers to be aware of and be able to do. User experience design is a more frequent title that my students get than cartographer. When I hear human-centered, I think more about sort of ergonomics, inclusion, accessibility, thinking more about maybe the cognitive perceptual components. And so a non-human centered practice, I have a hard time endorsing that. But one thing that would be a clear example would be sort of intelligent visualization. And so trying to come up with decision tree like designs that recommend a provided solution. And that could be something that's an AI that really becomes a sophisticated decision tree or some other kind of model. But it also is something that's as simple as Color Brewer, where it's trying to get you into practices that we know are viable, right? And so to give you a range of alternatives. Now, Color Brewer is based on a perceptual human-centered design, but the brewer itself as a concept would be sort of that alternative where we're trying to, help maybe the non-expert create reasonable designs. That's an interesting question because so much of my work is situated in human and user-centered design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. And another one is from Ethan S. Is there any research on using AI to develop new symbols?
So definitely in terms of using the word symbol broadly, I just recently published I guess you would call it like a lit review or a synthesis and review with Yuhao Kang and Song Gao in Cages that we did a corpus analysis. So we tried to collect a large volume of documents based on different keywords, not documents, of papers based on keywords that were cartography plus then all of these signals for artificial intelligence, or really it's mostly machine learning versus artificial intelligence, and then codify them by the GIS&T body of knowledge and the topics that are used in the body of knowledge. And symbolization, definitely the most common example is style transfer, and trying to, in particular, come up with color schemes that are emblematic of some other inspirational input. So training a model using a famous artist's work, or using like the USGS look from 1900, and then producing a set of styles of symbols. Style and symbol are kind of interchangeable in a lot of ways. Producing a set of symbols. Now, icon design, if that's what you meant, because I've showed a lot of icons, I haven't seen anything about that. Right now, it really is primarily sort of coming up with color palettes and style transfer, and primarily using GANs, and is what we found.
Okay.
But look at that paper, 2024.
Oh, fresh, very nice. The
Very
next
fresh, yeah.
next question would be from Nicholas Alt. Seems like a classic cartographic symbology, triangles, octagons, etc., has had a steep decline with the rise of digital interactive cartography. Seems most online maps are relying on glyph-based symbols, circles representing data points, plus choropleths might be an exception. What is your view on that development?
Yeah, so this is the syntactical question. That why are we choosing circles? There's some advantages to the circle. It's the most compact of our abstract geometric symbols. So if we're using shape as some sort of part, as a visual variable for some part of the design, it's going to render well on screens, which have much lower resolution, even still today, than printed ink does. And so in the past, it was almost impossible to render like a dot density map on a web map, just because of the aliasing with pixels made them look like squares, essentially. Whereas today we have higher resolution. I also think it's maybe a data volume question in terms of finding creative ways to render larger sets of data more quickly. And so if you render only points, only circles, you actually have performance benefits if you're trying to render more complex icons on screen. And then it's not just rendering them once, remember, because now we're interacting with them. And so then they need to be refreshed as you're panning and zooming. And so we were seeing interaction lags. Right. And so I think my answer is that the technology remains more limited even today. It's also empowering in new ways as well, as I tried to mention with sort of search and filtering and retrieval and calculate. The map is an interface to a database at this point. But personally, I think that's probably why we're seeing that Slippy map convention be either a set of points or a choropleth map as your kind of quote unquote hamburger cartography.
Okay, great. Any more questions? I don't see any hands up or anything. I had one while you were presenting. And how do we mediate among many people who, in quotation marks, make meaning out of the limitless complexity when they're viewing a map?
So this gets into in semiotics this concept of levels of meaning and the sort of layers of discourse that are going to be throughout any map representation. And so we know that a map is not a message in a bottle where we get to write it and throw it and everyone will receive that message the same way, right? And so kind of the communication paradigm, so to say. What's nice about representation as kind of a basis for how we view cartography is that it enables different layers of meaning to be imbued. And those layers of meaning can sometimes be antithetical. Well, first, some layers can be missed. And that's where sort of critical deconstruction helps us understand the intentions of the designer in a much deeper way, to see those connotations that were maybe otherwise not literal designations or appraisals on the map. But we also then enable some differences in the reaction. So differences in how our lived experience are going to make that interpretive distance farther or closer away. And even something like a border in Madison will be interpreted by folks who work at the Capitol one way and the Ho-Chunk Nation a different way, right?
Mm.
And so these connotations, these layers of meaning, are impossible to overcome. That's why cartography needs to be so intentional in its design, is that we want to, knowing that meaning is always going to vary, we want to try to occlude really harmful meanings. Unless the example with the iconic point symbol, that harmful meaning might trigger people to behave differently, right, in a more socially just way. And so I think what we're really trying to do is think about the harms that the map can do and choose not to make those maps, and then to receive feedback through user-centered design about the meanings that people are actually supplying or receiving as part of that sort of semiosis that's occurring.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But isn't that, in a way, if I can pick up on that, I'm just
Sure.
checking some more questions. If we go back to Mark Momanier's, title of the book, All Maps Lie. So are we in a point there where we also just generically need to consider how maps lie? And not in that metaphoric sense of Maumonier, but in the sense that, people also make the argument, whether we're using a Peircean approach, like you're taking up here with Alan McEachran's work, or we're using the older Saussurean approach, that there's more breaks between, especially the referent and the sign, that are constantly what people are having to work with, to work on, to be able to make sense out of things. And they're mainly relying on things they know already, things before they've seen the map. If you wanted to say it like a little bit more polemically, it would almost be the statement, there's no map we haven't seen. And on the other hand, there's never a map that we've seen, because every map that we're seeing relies so much on what we know already. And so, but the break is how we overcome that. And that's, I think, an interesting way to think about this pragmatic thing too.
Yeah, I think to answer that question in reverse, students come to my intro cartography class, and they think, why cartography? Hasn't everything been mapped already? And everywhere maybe has received some map, but everything probably not, because the world's so dynamic. But also, not everyone has had the chance to map, or mapping is something that is as a mental activity innate, right? And so I do think that in a lot of ways, we've never seen any map always is re-seen again. The same way that reading Alan's book last night in preparation for this lecture gave me new thoughts based on my growth and my new understanding as a scholar from when I was 20 and first read this book. And so I think what's key there is embracing the pluralism that is possible through this sort of semiotics, and leaning into it and being comfortable with it. And ultimately, I think the how to lie with maps question is one of pragmatics, right? Because we're trying to negotiate the meanings in these maps, and in doing so, come up with tentpoles or guardrails of best practices, knowing we're working within this complicated semiotics, right? And I think Mark did a really great job of exposing some, connotations of the map of, veracity and integrity that aren't necessarily, there as this perceived scientific document. And that's part of that cultural negotiation, I think.
Mm-hmm. It's cultural, but I also think it's something that we all do. But this relationship between culture and what we do to make sense is really interesting, and that's where the guidelines play a role. But maybe it also needs guidelines, not just for those of us who are making the maps, but also for those of us who are reading maps, so that there's some questions there.
Totally. In this like post-truth moment, what I would call like visual literacy is more important now than ever. Having curricula in K-12 that isn't necessarily about making maps, but it's just about understanding the assumptions behind them, and not even using maps, like getting out a ruler and measuring distances with the scale bar. but like understanding the map as sort of this cultural artifact, I think would be great. And I think it's happening, maybe not quickly enough, and not in as many places as we want. This is where I don't mean to make Esri products kind of like a straw person, but I think this is where Esri is doing great work with ArcGIS Online to provide that sense, that empowerment where like as a sixth grader, you can actually go out and make a web map and like do this, right? And here's all the assumptions that you did in the data creation process, the representation process, the interaction process, that helps give you a tangible example from that, from K6, K12 education.
Right. Well, we've thanks everyone for the comments, for the questions, for the participation. We've gone over the time a few minutes. I don't know if Rob's available for much longer, but I do want to make sure that everyone knows that we're formally finished now. And if you need to go, we're just going to wrap up, I think, in a few more minutes if there's any more questions or comments.
And also, please feel free to email me with questions. My contact information is on the slides, which I believe will be shared afterwards. So feel free to send me a message. I'm on sabbatical, so I've got nothing else to do than respond.
Nothing else to do. Oh, don't say that too quick. But yeah, thanks very, very much, Rob. And those of you who wonder, the link will be and the video will be available soon on the page of the ICA Geospatial Ontology Committee. I will send a note out to all of you who registered, signed up, I should say, for this meeting. So when that link's available. Okay. Thank you very much, Rob. It was a great, stimulating presentation. I know the commissions will have something to talk about in the future, and looking forward to that with a great anticipation. And again, thanks for taking the time to be with us today.
It's been an invitation.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.